presidente. Señor presidente.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, the permanent representatives, esteemed delegates, U.S. Citizens and Cubans resident in the United States who may be here in this room. I wish to express to the people and government of the United States, to Mayor Bill de Blasio, to Governor Andrew Cuomo, and the other authorities of New York, as well as to its citizens, and particularly to the families of the victims, we wish to express our most heartfelt condolences on behalf of the government and people of Cuba at this terrorist act which occurred yesterday afternoon. I wish also to express deep condolences to the peoples and governments of Argentina and Norway. Mr. President, I wish most vehemently to condemn the disrespectful, offensive, interfering statements made by the ambassador of the United States to the United Nations against Cuba and the Cuban government a few minutes ago. I would remind you that the United States, where flagrant violations of human rights are perpetrated, which cause great concern amongst the international community, has not the slightest moral authority to criticize Cuba, a small country, one which displays solidarity, whose international history has been broadly recognized, a noble people, a people who work hard, who are friendly. And she speaks on behalf of the leader of an empire, an imperialist power behind the majority of those wars being waged today on our globe, which take the lives of innocent people, the decisive factor of global instability and most serious threats to international peace and security, trampling upon international law and the Charter of the United Nations, which cynically she has just invoked. Madam Ambassador, you're wrong with your first sentence. It wasn't 55 years, it was 26 years of sessions here, and more than a century has gone by since the events we are debating today occurred. She is reflecting the tenor of U.S. politics today. Everything started even before the Cuban nation was born, when the Cuban people first rose in armed rebellion in 1868. Already the annexionist, imperialist appetites had been unleashed by what today is the U.S. imperial power. In 1898, using a pretext which marks the modern history of the United States, the explosion of the vessel Maine in a Cuban port, they entered as allies of the independentist Cuban forces and then subsequently occupied the country as invaders. They imposed the Platt Amendment. They curbed Cuba's independence and sovereignty. 3 military occupations were carried out, meaning 60 years of absolute domination, which were brought to an end on the 1st of January 1959 with the entry of the rebel army into Havana and the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. The triumph of the Cuban Revolution, which today wages those same battles that inspired our people more than 100 years ago. She is lying. She used words allegedly attributed to a Cuban source, a statement on the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, the October crisis. I would ask her to tell us her source, the author, to provide evidence. This seems to be one of those tweets that proliferate in this country in these times of hate, division, and divisive policy. At the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, the government of the U.S. had as its aim to change the regime. The policy initiated by President Trump on the 16th of June is nothing new. It's the same policy. It's an old policy rooted in the past. The ambassador referred to the distinguished American ambassador Adelaide Stevenson. She forgot to comment that it was his sad duty, deceived by his government, to demonstrate in a Security Council, to show photographs of what were allegedly Cuban aircraft, supposedly from the Cuban Air Force on the 15th of April, which bombed the city of Havana, causing many deaths and being a prelude to the attack of the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. These bombings and the involuntary lie of Ambassador Stevenson, who was deceived by his government, occurred even prior to the socialist declaration of the Cuban Revolution. These bombardments came before the socialist declaration of our revolution. She talked of the October crisis. Today, we are hearing talk of the assassination of President Kennedy and the declassification of documents. The truth has been hidden from the people of the United States for too long. Let all documents be declassified. But if she wants to talk of these issues, I would suggest that she reads the book delivered to assassinate Castro from CIA agents, referring to the meeting between CIA agent David Phillips and Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas in the third week of September 1963. History has been strewn with lies and aggressions. The North-South operation, the Mangosta operation, information has been declassified to the effect that then the U.S. had 261,000 soldiers standing ready for a direct invasion of Cuba. There was a CIA base in Florida, the largest one in history up to that date, with more than 700 officials. And until the creation of a greater base in Saigon, it was the largest one. It's a judgment rather like Alice expressed in Wonderland. First of all, a ruling, and then the trial comes afterwards. I speak on behalf of my people, and I also speak for those who cannot call on President Trump and the ambassador of the United States, who cannot call them by their names, but who share my feelings. At least she has recognized the total isolation of the United States in this room and in this world. They stand alone when it comes to the blockade against Cuba. She disregards the weight of truth. Now, she underestimates the strength of an idea of truth with an idea of a more powerful army, as José Martín said. He was writing an unfinished letter. He said, "Every day I am in the danger of giving my life for my country and my duty for the independence of Cuba, so that the U.S. may not once again fall upon our land." Madam Ambassador, more than 26 years ago, much longer than 55 years ago, together with military aggression, the fabrication of pretexts, plans for direct invasion, measures to suffocate our economy, state terrorism, destabilization and subversion. There was a proposal, and I now quote the infamous memorandum of Lester Mallory, the Under-Secretary of State, signed on the 6th of April, 1960, where he wrote, provoke dissatisfaction and disenchantment by means of economic hardship and penury, denying money to Cuba, denying supplies, so as to reduce real and nominal wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of government. The blockade then was created against Cuba with these aims. However, when President Raúl Castro Ruz and President Barack Obama made the unexpected and hopeful announcements of the 17th of December 2014, the latter, President Obama, described the blockade as a failed and obsolete policy, ineffective in meeting its goals, which had caused damage to the Cuban people, as well as the isolation of the U.S. government. Subsequently, he described it as useless in advancing U.S. interests, a failed, nonsensical, and unviable policy, a burden to all citizens. However, the blockade was never recognized as a flagrant, massive, and systematic violation of the human rights of Cubans. What was cynically admitted by the U.S. ambassador a few hours ago. Neither was this recognized as a violation of international law or an act of genocide under the Geneva Convention. And its purposes of a subjugation of our people were never renounced. However, the U.S. president then repeatedly stated that he had decided to use his executive powers and work with the U.S. Congress to lift the blockade. A reflection of this willingness in practice was the vote to abstain by the United States in 2016 on this resolution, regarding which the U.S. ambassador has just been mocking. During this period, substantial progress was made in terms of diplomatic relations, dialogue, and cooperation in areas of mutual interest and benefit. But the blockade over the last 2 years remained unchanged, although some executive decisions were made that modified its implementation in a very limited fashion, but in a positive direction. The form under which the travel ban to go to Cuba, which again flouted Cuban rights that she failed to mention, it was significant that there was an expansion of travel licenses, and tangible results were achieved in the area of mutually beneficial bilateral cooperation in such very important areas as tackling terrorism, drug trafficking, or cybercrime. Mr. President, on the 16th of June last, President Donald Trump described the blockade as the essence of his anti-Cuban policy and announced a series of measures intended further to tighten it. In an old-fashioned and hostile speech, typical of the Cold War, given before an audience made up inter alia by staunch followers of the Batista regime, annexationists and terrorists, the U.S. President reiterated the threadbare allegations of human rights violations in Cuba to justify the tightening of the blockade. In this forum, we heard his sentiments echoed. President Trump does not have the least moral authority to question Cuba. He is heading a government of millionaires, aiming to implement savage measures against low-income families, against the poor people in this country, minorities and immigrants. He is pursuing a program that encourages hatred and division. He proclaims a dangerous exceptionalism and supremacism under the guise of patriotism, which will lead to more violence. He ignores the support of his electors, 2/3 of the U.S., those electors, and also Cubans resident in the United States of America who support the end of the blockade. The current policies in the United States harm citizens. They mean politics are rife with corruption, hijacked by special interests, the interests of corporate money. There is a lack of guarantees for education, health, and social security. There are restrictions on unionization and terrible gender discrimination. The use of torture deserves to be condemned. The assassination of African Americans by law enforcement agents, the death of civilians at the hands of U.S. troops, the indiscriminate and racially biased application of the death penalty, the assassination, repression, and policing of migrants, the separation of families, and the arrest or deportation of minors, as well as the brutal measures threatening the children of illegal aliens who grew up and studied in the United States, all of these deserve condemnation. This is the government which lost the popular vote. The ambassador of the United States has expressed her dream to us. I prefer that of Martin Luther King when he said, "I dream that one day this nation will rise up and live the true significance of its belief that all men are created equal, that there be freedom. She's come to tell us that she recognizes that the future of the island lies in the hands of the Cuban people. She is blatantly lying. This was never so. In history, it's the history of attempts at domination and hegemony exercised over Cuba. The policy, which is heralded, is intended to draw back relations to a past of confrontation to satisfy the interests of extremists on the U.S. right and a frustrated and aged minority of Cuban origin in Florida. The presidential memorandum establishing a policy on Cuba includes, amongst other measures, new prohibitions on economic, commercial, and financial relations of United States companies with Cuban undertakings. It also further restricts the freedom of travel of U.S. citizens after the elimination of individual journeys under the category of people to people, and also implements surveillance measures to all other visitors of that country. During the last few weeks, President Donald Trump has on 4 different occasions reiterated the fact that his government will not lift the blockade against Cuba unless Cuba introduces changes in its domestic order. Today, I say that Cuba will never agree to conditions or anything being imposed of this order, and we remind the President and his ambassador that this focus, which was implemented by 10 or so of his predecessors, has never worked, and neither will it ever work in the future. He will be one more president implementing a policy that means a return to the past. More recently, using as a pretext the ailments affecting some diplomats in Havana, and without possessing the slightest proof of their cause and origin, because they lie when they talk of attacks or incidents, or without any conclusions from ongoing investigations available, the U.S. government has adopted new political measures against Cuba, which further tighten the blockade and affect bilateral relations as a whole. Amongst other measures, he decided to suspend the issuing of immigrant and non-immigrant visas in the U.S. consulate in Havana, which prejudices the rights of citizens freely to travel and visit the country for short periods of time. More than 163,000 Cubans have carried out such journeys this year. It also seriously hampers the family reunification of others who benefited from the bilateral agreement, which stated that no fewer than 20,000 immigrant visas would be issued every year. The requirement for travelers to submit to face-to-face interviews at U.S. consulates in third countries and immigrants in the U.S. consular section in Bogota, respectively, will enormously increase the cost of these procedures and make them unviable for many of the people involved. Where are their rights in the U.S. narrative? There is no way of justifying harm caused to people and their families in order to pursue political goals which are against Cuba's constitutional order. The United States government, with the political aim of restricting travel and harming international tourism in Cuba, has also issued an unfounded and mendacious warning to U.S. citizens to prevent them from visiting our country. By means of the unjustified removal of the Cuban staff working at our General Consulate in Washington, the only one in the United States, they have seriously impaired its ability to provide services to U.S. travelers, particularly to Cubans residing in this country, who have the absolute right to visit and enjoy normal relations with their nation. Likewise, the staff of our embassy has been arbitrarily and unfoundedly reduced, which has led, amongst other consequences, to the dismantling of its economic and commercial office, pursuing the evil political purpose of depriving the U.S. business sector, which is generally interested in exploring existing business opportunities in Cuba. They still exist despite the restrictions imposed by the blockade regulations. It is no surprise either, having heard what the ambassador said here, and previously what her leaders stated, that the U.S. president disregards the unanimous international support for the progress achieved that he is now reversing, and the similar call for the immediate, absolute and unconditional end to the blockade. Mr. President, as was stated by President Raúl Castro Ruiz on the 14th of July last, we reiterate that any strategy intended to destroy the revolution, either through coercion or pressure or by resorting to subtle methods, is doomed to failure. Cuba is willing to continue negotiating the pending bilateral issues with the United States based on equality and respect for the sovereignty and independence of our country. And we are willing to continue the respectful dialogue and cooperation with the U.S. government in areas of common interest. He said, Cuba and the United States can cooperate and coexist, respecting their differences and promoting all that may benefit both countries and peoples. But it should not be expected that, in order to achieve this, Cuba will make concessions on its sovereignty or independence, or negotiate its principles, or agree to preconditions of any sort, as we have never done throughout the history of our revolution. End of quote. Mr. President, for the 26th consecutive occasion today, Cuba is presenting to the United Nations General Assembly the draft resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Blockade imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. At the present time, this text becomes all the more relevant given the setback ensuing from the actions taken by the U.S. administration against Cuba. The blockade is the biggest impediment to the economic and social development of our country and the implementation of the national plan, which is consonant with the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. It is the main obstacle to the development of Cuba's economic, commercial, and financial relations with the United States and the rest of the world. According to the figures very carefully calculated by Cuban institutions, between April 2016 and April 2017, the losses caused by the blockade to the Cuban economy has been estimated at approximately $4,305 billion. This is about twice as much as what is needed in terms of annual direct foreign investment for the Cuban economy substantially to move towards development. The accumulated damage amounts to the vast figure of $822,280 billion, taking into account the devaluation of the price of gold. At current prices, this figure is equivalent to $130,178 billion. Many banks in third countries have been affected in recent years by the extreme tenacious persecution of Cuba's financial transactions. The blockade is contrary to international law. Its aggressive extraterritorial implementation harms the sovereignty of all states. It also damages economic and business interests throughout the world. Mr. President, the U.S. ambassador failed to mention that the blockade is a flagrant, massive, and systematic violation of the human rights of all Cubans, men and women. It, under the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948, can be defined as an act of genocide. It is an obstacle to the international humanitarian cooperation that Cuba offers to 81 countries in the South. The human damage caused by the implementation of this policy is incalculable. There is not a single Cuban family or social service in Cuba that has not suffered from the deprivations and consequences of the blockade. Cuban immigration is also subject to discrimination and prejudice. During the course of the last year, the Cuban company that imports and exports medical products, Cuba Si, submitted purchase requests to 18 U.S. companies, which either refused to sell or failed to respond to these requests. Others, like the U.S. corporation Promega, of international renown for the manufacture of diagnosis kits to test the viral load in HIV/AIDS, hepatitis C, or kidney pathologies, refused in June 2017 to sell its products to Cuba Si, claiming that the U.S. Treasury Department is still enforcing commercial sanctions that prohibit the sale of its products to the island of Cuba. On that same date, and using the same argument, a refusal notice was received from the company New England Biolabs, Inc., which markets a broad range of enzymes, such as proteinase K, a reagent that makes it possible to diagnose viral diseases such as dengue, Zika, and chikungunya, as well as other enzymes with multiple uses in the diagnosis of congenital malformations and the determination of the degree of compatibility between donors and patients receiving a kidney, bone marrow, or liver transplant, amongst others. With this same argument, this company refused to deliver humanitarian supplies, totally humanitarian supplies to Cuba. In April 2017, the German supplier Eckert & Ziegler Radiopharma refused to supply to the same Cuban medical company the generator GA68 with its components. This equipment is used to diagnose prostate cancer. According to the company, it was impossible for it to supply the product directly to Cuba Neither was it possible to do so through a third country because of the blockade. The cardiology service of the clinical and surgical hospital Hermanos Ameijeros needs a circulatory support device to be able to treat a cardiogenic shock and perform cardiology interventions and electrophysiology, which would allow the recovery of patients suffering from heart failure and contribute to extending their lives. The U.S. company Abiomed, the world market leader for these products, which sells the Impaler system, which is ideal for the treatment of these aforementioned disorders, in September 2016 and February 2017, the Cuban company Cuba Si contacted that company to discuss the possibility of incorporating that product in the Cuban health system. But to date, it has refused to respond to the request. Mr. President, our deepest thanks go to all governments and peoples, parliaments, political forces and social movements, representatives of civil society, international and regional organizations, which year after year have contributed their voices and their votes to substantiate the fairness and urgency of abolishing the blockade. We would also like to convey our gratitude to the large majority of the U.S. people for their support for this noble purpose. The conscience of mankind is offended at the fact that the ambassador of the United States should have referred in an interfering fashion, which is unacceptable to the Bolivarian government of Venezuela. The heroic people of Venezuela, its civil and military union, the Bolivarian Chavist government, headed by President Nicolas Maduro, is offended at this. The government of the United States lies when it states that there is that Venezuela is a threat to national security, international security. It is, strangely enough, the leading reserve of hydrocarbons in the world. As the liberator Simon Bolivar wrote, the United States appears destined by providence to inflict poverty on America in the name of liberty. I would respond to the ambassador with Bolivar's words. We are in the midst of an impeccable constitutional electoral process in Cuba, where seats are not bought, neither do special interests prevail. There are no lying campaigns governed by money. These are elections where there is no manipulation of the will of voters, elections where a division and hate are not fostered. Mr. President, we very particularly wish to praise all those who voiced concern and rejection of the coercive measures announced by the current U.S. government. The people of Cuba will never renounce its purpose of building a sovereign, independent, socialist, democratic, prosperous, sustainable country. We shall continue with the consensus of our people, and in particular, the patriotism of youngest Cubans combating imperialism and defending our independence. Thousands of Cubans have lost their lives, as was shown in Playa Girón, and in the face of all threats, we have undergone extreme danger. We shall be faithful to José Martín and Fidel Castro Ruiz. Mr. President, distinguished permanent representatives, esteemed delegates, ladies and gentlemen, our people are following this debate with hope in their hearts. It is on their behalf that I ask you to vote in favor of draft resolution A/72/L2. Necessity of ending the economic, commercial and financial blockade imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Thank you very much.